بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد ختم الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah. This is, inshallah, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept everyone's sacrifice and everyone's efforts and everyone's and taking out a lot of time from their lives. And we know we're all busy. We all have our things that we can be doing right now, but sacrificing that for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, will not go unrewarded. And these types of sacrifices tend to be the heaviest things on the day of judgment, on the scales. So we have one final session, again based on the hadith of Jibril, where there was 4 questions asked, and we're going to, inshallah, the 4th question about the end times will be its own day, because it's an ocean, and it's what I like to call edutainment. Right, so there's those people who like conspiracy theories and all that stuff. Right, they tend to like those kind of lessons. Talk about like the Antichrist and all these things, right? But they're very as entertaining as it is. It's extremely important to have that clarity from the Prophet ﷺ. But the 3rd question is what we'll finish with today, which is أخبرني عن الإحسان. Right, the angel Gabriel, he said, inform me about ihsan. And again, with regards to the Arabic language specifically, we always try to start with understanding the root of the word, because every word in Arabic has a 3-letter root. Right, sometimes there's a 4-letter root, but most of the words are a 3-letter root. And understanding that root is necessary in order to understand the word as a whole. Right, as opposed to understanding it in just translation. Because as soon as you just do a translation of a word, you are only getting one of the possible meanings, because the nature of translation is that it's limiting. But if you understand it in the Arabic, even in a basic sense, you get a bigger picture. So if the word Hasan, the root letters Ha, Sin, Nun, which is ihsan, Ha, Sin, Nun, it means beauty, right? Hasan or Husn, right? There may be a brother named Hassan or Hussein, right? There may be a sister. What's your name? Hussein? Hassan, mashallah. Or you might have a sister named Husna, right? Or Hasina. Is that your name? Is that your sister? Mashallah. Right. So these are all from that same word, right? And the Prophet ﷺ's grandchildren, who are the children of Ali ibn Abi Talib. So Ali married the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ. And their children are named Hassan and Hussein, both from this word. And they had a 3rd child, which is not as commonly mentioned, because he passed away as very young. And his name was Muhsin, also from the same root. Right, so Hassan means beauty. And a part of the meaning of Hasan is Kamal, which is perfection. All right, so and this is why they translate it generally as excellence. But the 4th verbal form, ihsan, which is the same form as Islam, right, and Iman, this means to do that root meaning, to cause that root meaning. So to cause beauty or to cause excellence is ihsan. And Allah mentions about the good doers in the Quran, that they're muhsinin, right? They're people who cause beauty in the world, right? In Allah la yudi'u ajra al-muhsinin. Allah will never let the reward of those who cause beauty in the world to go unrewarded. And we know that Allah mentions in the Quran multiple places that the purpose of our life in this world, liyabluwakum ayyukum ahsanu amala, to test which of you is most beautiful in deeds. Which of you is ahsan, and this is from the same root letters, to who is most beautiful in deeds or most excellent in deeds. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ was sent li'utammima makarim al-akhlaq in one narration, wa ahasin al-akhlaq in another. Right? That the Prophet was sent, as he said, I was only sent to perfect excellent character. right? Beautiful character. So beautiful character existed, but he came to perfect it, to take it to its pinnacle, right? And the character of the Prophet ﷺ, is unmatchable. Just his absolute selflessness, his absolute, right? In every aspect, every quality that relates to the heart, he was the example for that quality. Tamam. So this question, what is excellence, right, has over time been codified and preserved and served, and has become a science in its own self. Now, we talk about these things as sciences now, but at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he was teaching all of these things in one go. It wasn't like, okay, let's sit down and learn fiqh. Okay, let's sit down and learn purification of the heart. No, he was just teaching them day in and day out, right? And all of these meanings were there. So, right, in one class, they may be learning rules about things, but they're also learning the inward realities of those things. They may be learning about beliefs, but they're also learning about practices, right? All organically in one. But it's really difficult to teach somebody unless you have 23 years to do that, right? Like the Prophet ﷺ did. But if you want to sit down somebody and teach them the basics of their religion, it's easier to compartmentalize it, right? So the scholars turn these into sciences in and of themselves for that reason. It's easier to transmit. It's easier to preserve. It's easier to write a book about one topic instead of writing a book about all of Islam in one shot, right? It's hard to digest that knowledge that way. Whereas the Prophet ﷺ, it wasn't like, okay, time for class. Everything was class. They would stare at him and watch him and everything he did, how he dealt with the elderly, how he dealt with the children, how he dealt with foreigners who came to visit, how he dealt with the locals, how he dealt with family members, right? They learned and they were just studying everything about his movements and his actions and his dealings. So this has become its own science. And in the end, really, it all becomes one unified or synchronized practice of Islam. So the Quran, so ihsan, if we go back to the actual question, maybe I can bring it up here. If anyone gets dizzy, just don't look. So if you go back to I think it's this one, right here. If we go back to there, the question, inform me about excellence. Everyone see that? Excellence, right? So excellence, ihsan, right? It's a attempt at translating something of the meaning, right? You can say, inform me about beauty, right? Inform me about excellence, inform me about spiritual excellence, which is really what's alluded here. The Prophet ﷺ's response was, it is to worship Allah as though you see him, right? Now, imagine this, right? If the veils between us and the unseen realm were to be removed completely, and all of the sudden you were privy, right, to seeing the angels and seeing, right, the unseen realm and having a direct witnessing of the divine, how would your worship be? How would your prayer change, right? Instead of the way that we're praying now, instead of the way that we're praying now, right? When sometimes we get distracted and everything. If the veils were completely removed and we were witnessing Allah, right? What would our prayer look like in that moment, right? How much different would our prayer be inwardly and outwardly? So outwardly, we would be absolute still, out of awe and out of majesty, out of just reverence for the majesty of Allah's greatness, right? And inwardly, it would be, right, absolute, just being engrossed in that meaning of communion with Allah and that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now imagine that same idea in every single act of every single dealing, right? Every individual. When our parents say something that just bothers us, right? But at that moment we are witnessing Allah, how would we respond? Right? We would respond in a way that's pleasing only to Allah. Right? Everything else would fall secondary. Right? My nafs or my desire, me wanting to kind of get the upper hand or say something really smart, all of that would just fall away. Right? And this is the idea that the Prophet ﷺ is saying, that is ihsan. It is to worship Allah as though you see him. And this applies to the outward aspect worships, but also applies to inner worships. And if you do not see him, so this is a concession. Like if we're not at that level yet, right, then know that indeed he sees you, right? So these are two levels that the Prophet is talking about. And the scholars, they mention that the first one is called mushahada. Mushahada, there was a sister, shahada, right, from the same root word, right, which means to witness, right? When we do the testification of faith, you say, I bear witness, ashhadu, right? It's the same root words. So mushahada is to witness, right, the divine, that the veils on the hearts are removed, and one is privy to the realities of the divine through that inspiration. And Imam Ali, the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ and the fourth caliph, he said, "Lo kushifa al-ghita'u mazdadtu yaqina." If the veil between me and the unseen realm was to be removed right now, my certainty would not increase, because his certainty was already at its maximum. Right? The Prophet said something, he knew it was absolute truth. Right? Even though he wasn't seeing the unseen. And these are realities that are possible. And having seen this in my own life, in my own eyes, there are people who Allah, because of their state of their heart, Allah has removed the veils from their hearts. And they live in a different world that we live. Their bodies are with us, but their hearts are 100% focused on Allah at all moments. Right? And that is how they live. One of the great scholars, they said that for the past 17 years, I've been answering people's questions, and they think that I'm talking to them, but I've been conversing with Allah the whole time. Right? Sheikh Abu Bakr bin Sadam, who was on that chain of transmission, for the last 19 years of his life, even in his old age, he passed away at 80, he would sit only the way we sit in the end of the prayer. In private, in public, right? When he was in a formal class or whether he was just relaxing. And they said, "Ya Sheikh, why don't you like stretch your legs out? You're old, you're getting older, up there in years, right? Why don't you stretch?" He said, "This is the way a servant sits before his Lord." Right? In private and in public. This is their witnessing. They were in constant witnessing at all times because they reached this level of ihsan. But if a person is not at that level, right, then there's something called muraqabah. Muraqabah is to be constantly aware of the fact that Allah is watching me, that Allah knows everything about me, that Allah is present with me, right, in His knowledge and in His mercy, that to have that deep relationship with Allah, regardless of whether one is in an act of worship or not. Right? Somebody might be eating biryani, but they realize that at all times that nothing escapes the knowledge of Allah, that everything I do, every thought that crosses my heart, Allah knows about it. Right? So that's a rung in the ladder towards that other level. Right? So it's a step down though. So this is the goal, essentially. This is the result of knowledge put into practice. And every single act of worship that is part of our religion is meant to have a certain effect on the heart. Right? Every single good deed has a certain type of light and a certain healing aspect on the spiritual heart that cannot be achieved through a different act of worship. Right? So something you can achieve spiritually through the prayer, what you could not achieve spiritually through the fasting. Right? And you can achieve through fasting what you could not achieve through, for instance, charity. Right? So all of these acts of worship are aimed to cure the heart of these spiritual sicknesses. So the sciences that I'm just going to scroll all the way back. The science that was codified and preserved based on this is the science of purification of the heart. And the Quran refers it as the term Tazkiya. Tazkiya. Linguistically, Tazkiya means to purify. It's from the same word as zakat. Zakat is the charity which purifies your wealth. But it's the process of implementing the commandments of Allah Most High and His Messenger ﷺ that relate to one's spiritual state in order to achieve ihsan, in order to achieve the state of excellence mentioned in that hadith. The subject matters that Tazkiyah talks about are the commandments and the prohibitions of the Quran and the Sunnah, meaning the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, that relate to the heart. Right? So there is outward commands like doing the prayer, like giving charity, but there's also inward commands as well, like gratitude, sincerity, humility. These are just as much important as the outward aspects, and arguably more important, right? And the sins of the limbs, right? They have a harming effect on the heart. They harm the hearts. They darken the hearts. They veil the heart from the lights of understanding and knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there are outward prohibitions, but there are also inward prohibitions, inward things that Allah is saying, these are poison for your spiritual state. And they are just as important to remove as the outward sins. So if somebody was eating if you offered a Muslim 9 times out of 10, if you offered them a pork sandwich, they would be like, astaghfirullah, that's haram, right? Right? Even those who are not necessarily that practicing would know that and would not want to eat the pork sandwich, right? And pretty much across the board, you'd probably get the same reaction, right? And some of them, you'd probably get a reaction like disgust because they know that it's impure as well. But arguably, arrogance is way worse than eating a pork sandwich. Arrogance is way worse than eating a pork sandwich. So think about this. And you have one Muslim brother, unfortunately, he kind of fell off a little bit. He's not really practicing. He's over there eating a pork sandwich, right? And then you have someone else who is outwardly religious. They got all the garb, they got all the, they got the thobe, they got the oils, they got all the gear. And then they look at that brother eating the pork sandwich and they look down on them. Like, I'm better than him. They might not say it on their tongue, but they have that feeling. The one eating the pork sandwich is better than 1,000 of these guys. Why? Because the sin of that person is an outward sin, right? The sin of this person is an inward sin, way worse than that one, right? Arrogance is way worse than eating a pork sandwich, right? So this is the reality of how important and how central the realities of the heart, right? And these inward realities are in our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Shaykh Abu Bakr bin Saddam, similar to that example, he said that the humble and remorseful sinner is better than the arrogant person who is obedient. So you have a person who is outwardly doing acts of worship and they're pious and they're outward, but inwardly they're arrogant. You have another person who is outwardly doing things that are not permissible or they're sinful, but inwardly they're really brokenhearted that they're in this state and they really want to do better. And they're just broken. They're kind of remorseful, a little bit, that they're crying at night. Ya Allah, take this away from me. Help me out of this sin. Right? The one who is remorseful is better than 1,000 of the other one. Now imagine if there was somebody who was outwardly doing sins and still arrogant. Right? They're outwardly disobeying Allah and they still think they're better than everybody else. Right? They're the worst of the worst. Right? And then there are people who are outwardly obedient to Allah. They would leave anything that was even doubtful, right, in regards to their relationship with Allah, and inwardly they're still broken and still remorseful and still asking Allah to forgive them. And this is the way of the prophets and the righteous, that they were the most humble, even though they had all the things to brag about, but they knew that even that obedience was a gift from Allah. It wasn't of their own accord. It was a blessing in itself. So they ascribed the blessing to Allah. Tamam. So this is just a couple of verses with regards to the word of purification. Allah says in chapter 91, I believe this is Surah Al-Shams. I think it's Surah Al-Shams. وَالشَّمْسِ وَالضُّحَاهَا وَالْقَمَرِ إِذَا تَلَاهَا Yeah, Surah Al-Shams. Right? وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. This is actually multiple verses, 3 verses. All right, and so Allah swears by the soul, right? And by the soul and the one who fashioned it. So he swears by himself. Then with the knowledge of right and wrong inspired it. So all of us are inspired. We know inside what is right and what is wrong. We have this inward mechanism that with knowledge can support that, but we all have this inward mechanism to know right from wrong, virtue from vice, right? And this is why the Prophet said, ask your heart. If you really don't know, it's a gray area, how do you feel, right? Sin is that which bothers the heart. Right? And you would dislike that people come to know about it. So he says, successful indeed is the one who purifies their soul, and doomed is the one who corrupts their soul. Right? And this is one of the many verses of the Quran with regards to it. Another is, if we can see that Allah talks about the prophets and why they were sent. Right? Again, why is probably the most important question of all. What is easy once you have a why? Since we have sent you a messenger from amongst yourselves, so he's speaking to the Muslims, reciting to you our revelation. So the first task of the prophets is to convey revelation. Purifying you. The second task of the prophets is to be a means of spiritual purification of people, to remove from their hearts these spiritual diseases. All right, and third, teaching you the book and the wisdom. The wisdom is actually the guidance of the Prophet himself. And teaching you what you never knew before. So purification of the heart has always been there. And so that's from the Quran. This is a prophetic narration. The Messenger of Allah said, Inna Allah la yanzuru ila suwurikum. Surah, who was asking about surah the other day. إن الله لا ينظر إلى صوركم وأموالكم ولكن ينظر إلى قلوبكم وأعمالكم. Truly, Allah does not look at your forms or your possessions. Rather, He looks at your hearts and your actions. In another narration, He looks at your hearts and intentions. Right? Allah doesn't care about what kind of clothes we're wearing. Right? Allah doesn't care about what a person looks like. Right? It's all about the heart. Right? What is their heart? Because I have seen people who, right, in our society, no one would give them a second glance. Right? They're not famous, right? They're not even particularly good looking, right? They're not known, right? People just walk past them. But these are people who have hearts that are so pure that they will go outside and beg people for money and humble themselves in that way just to collect it, to give it to some orphans in the end of the day, without even telling anybody that's what they're doing. So people are looking, it's just a beggar. Right? And people just walk past them. Some would just throw money on the ground, right? And some of them would just not give them the time of day and look down on them. But this person is a person of Allah. This is a person who, in the heavens, they are known. Right? In the unseen realm, they are known. They're famous in the unseen realm, but people don't care about them. Right? And the Prophet said that it's likely that there's a person who is dusty, disheveled, and no one wants to have anything to do with them, that if they were to say, I swear by Allah on something, that Allah would make that thing happen on their behalf out of honor for that person. And this is the reality of the spiritual states. One last hadith. The Messenger of Allah he said, truly when the believer sins, there is a dark spot on their heart, on his heart. If he repents and seeks forgiveness, the heart is polished, completely freed of that sin. And if he continues to sin and he goes down that path, it will grow, meaning the dark spot will grow until it overcomes his heart entirely. And that is the stain that Allah mentions in the verse, كَلَّا بَرَّانَ عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ مَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ. But no, in fact, their hearts have been stained by all the evil they used to commit. So there's constantly in the Quran a mention of the heart and the effects of the limbs have on the heart. This is, so if you can see, that is a compilation of supplications made by Imam al-Haddad, and he was on that chart. He's one of the great scholars of the 11th century of Yemen. He gave a definition of a quality called taqwa. Taqwa means God consciousness. Bad translation. It means a lot more than that. Fear of God, which has a bad connotation, but in the Islamic understanding, it's actually a good thing. Fear is a praiseworthy quality of the heart. But fear in the right sense of the word. So taqwa is one of the most praised qualities of the Quran. There's 150 verses about the virtues of having this quality, this inward quality. And it's seen as the pinnacle of worship. And taqwa and ihsan, taqwa and ihsan are used interchangeably very often. So he defines taqwa. He says, taqwa is to obey the commandments of Allah and to abstain from His prohibitions outwardly and inwardly. So those things that are outwardly impermissible and those things that are inwardly impermissible. Those things that are outwardly obligations and those things that are inwardly obligations, out of a sense of reverence and awe of Allah. right? So it's not that a person leaves a sin because they hear some footsteps coming up the stairs and they close their computer. That's not taqwa, right? If anything, that's hypocrisy, right? Whereas that a person is more afraid of a person, of another human, than they are of Allah, right? But true taqwa is to do it out of reverence for God, that God deserves to be obeyed. And one of the righteous mentioned that even if God never created heaven and he never created hell, he still deserves to be worshipped, right? So even if we don't get anything out of the deal, he still deserves to be worshipped, right? Because of his perfection and his creating us to him. So this is just a brief overview of something that takes a lifetime to implement. It's very easy to just list these off and say how they're cured. But to actually do it is to go against that lower nature of the self. Right? And we'll mention a little bit of what the cure is for some of these. Right? So the sins of the heart, and there's more than this, but these are the main ones. Arrogance is at the top of the list. Right? Arrogance is directly against our purpose in life. Our purpose in life is to have servitude and humility before our Creator. Right? And one of the worst qualities of all is arrogance. Why? Because we are essentially ascribing attributes of God to ourselves, that we are better. But what do the Muslims say when we start the prayer? Allahu Akbar. And the same root word is kibr. Kibr is arrogance. Akbar is the same root word. So Allah is the absolutely great. Allah is the only one who is great. Absolutely. And we are only great insofar as we are connected to Allah. Right? Of our own self, we have nothing to brag about. Imam Ali said, how could you be arrogant when your beginning was an impure fluid? Your end will be the food of worms. And in between those two, you're carrying impurities at all times in you. Like, what are we bragging about? We have nothing. If Allah just cut off the oxygen for a few minutes, all of us would be begging on the ground. All of us. And this is the reality behind all of us. We can feign that we're great, that we have some sort of status in the world. It's all an illusion, right? In reality. So arrogance is at the top, and a lot of these branch off of arrogance. Some of these other ones are only there because there's arrogance. Hatred for other people. Envy. And envy, the definition of envy is not that you want something that someone else wants. That's fine, right? Someone else has achieved something and you want to achieve that as well. That's fine. Envy is when you are bothered that they achieved that thing. It hurts you, right? It burns inside. How did they get that new car? How did they get that promotion? How did they get this? Right? I want that, right? Just having that feeling is called envy. Worse than that would be that you want them to lose that blessing. Right? That would be even worse. Right? Rancor, which is a type of hatred. Ill suspicions. Who does he think he is? Man, he's showing off. How do you know? Are you unveiled? The realities of his heart are unveiled to you that he's showing off. Ostentation, which is riya in Arabic, means to show off, essentially, showing off. There's a funny story. There was a guy, he was in the masjid, and he was praying. And while he was praying, he could overhear some people in the back talking about him. So during the prayer, he's kind of like listening in on what they're saying. And they were praising him. So they were like, yeah, this guy over here who's praying, right? He prays so much. He does this, he gives charity, he does all these things. And the guy's like, yeah, keep going. In his prayer, he can hear what they're saying. And then they stopped. And he's like, and I'm fasting, by the way. Right? So that showing off is to do any act of worship for the sake of people to see, to acknowledge, right? Instead of doing it so that Allah sees. Ujub, which is self-conceit, is closely related to that. Is to be impressed by oneself. So you have a person who comes in the morning for the morning prayer or something. And after having spent hours in voluntary prayer throughout the night, right? And then they walk inside and they're like, if only these people knew what I was doing last night. Like, I'm so pious, right? That's what self-conceit is, which is essentially ascribing the blessing of obedience or worship to oneself. That I did it of my own accord. Because of my knowledge, I did this, or because of my efforts, I did this. Instead of saying, Alhamdulillah, that God is the one who enabled me to do this. Love of worldliness, meaning love of things that have no significance in one's purpose of life, have no significance to with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just merely material things. Love of status, right, which is related to ostentation. Long hopes is essentially related to the love of worldliness. It usually translates into essentially a dislike of leaving this world. And no one wants to die, right? It's not healthy to want to die unless someone is completely engrossed in love of Allah, and they're just there's the only, right? There's people like that. It's not really a normal thing to be like that. But there's people that's no, I can't leave this. I have things that I want to do on it. Right? We were not created for this life. We were created in this life, but not for this life. Right? Our goal is what's after death. And unfortunately, in our times, much of what we see as success, people's goals and their intentions and their pursuits all end at the grave. It's what do you want out of life? I want this, I want this, I want this, I want this. And then you die, then what? Right? And they don't have an answer. Whereas the people of Allah, their goals start at death. Right? They want to be eternally in the presence of their Creator. They want to lay eyes on their Creator. And this is what will happen in paradise. They want to be with the Messenger of Allah in the highest levels of paradise for eternity. And that's their goal. And all of this in this world is just nothing in comparison to that. And this is how people, right, despite the terrible genocide that they're going for, they can still smile. And they can still be under the small refugee tent while bombs are going on around, still singing poems about the praise of the Prophet and how beautiful the Prophet was. How can they do that? It's because they love that life more than they do this life. Right? And one of the companions of the Prophet, Bilal, he's actually Abyssinian, he's an Ethiopian. He was about to die. And he lived in Syria at the end of his life. And his wife was saying, wow, Karaba, what a calamity. Her husband's about to die. And he said, no, don't say that. He said, wow, Taraba, what a celebration. Right? غَدًا أَلْقَى الْحِبَّةِ مُحَمَّدًا وَحِزْبَهِ. Tomorrow I will meet my beloveds, Muhammad and his companions. And that was his ending. That's how he died. Right? That was his state in the end, that he was going towards his beloved, not away from it. Right? So this last one, Long Hopes, has a long explanation. So that's really, I think, the hotspot turned off. Yeah, that's really all I wanted to mention. If anyone wants to jump in, we wanted to keep this last session a bit lighter, just because for the sake of time. Yeah, I kind of opened the door and then just left it open. Yeah, so generally, a lot of times the cure is the opposite of the sickness, right? So if someone feels that they have arrogance, and this shouldn't be kind of self-prescribed, because some of these things have to be done wisely, because we can't change ourselves overnight. These things are, right? In the early times, they would spend a whole year or two with their students just working on one quality, right? And just working on nothing but arrogance for 2 years straight. So what they would do generally is do the opposite. So if someone feels that they're better than someone else, right, they may go and arrange their shoes and put it out for them. Here you go, right? Serve them food, right? Do things to humble themselves before that person. It's really hard to do that, because everything inside is just nah, I don't like this guy, right? Or for instance, envy. You're really bothered that your coworker got the promotion that you were trying to get, right? and it's just burning you in the heart, right? So instead of going down that path, which would lead to hatred, which would lead to speaking ill of them behind their back, which would lead to all these other sicknesses, then what one would do is to pray to Allah to increase them in that blessing, to continue to give them things that you also want. So if you want your new car, ya Allah, give them that car, right, instead of me. And it's just really, it's hard to do, right? It's going to be bitter. Right? And they give the example of the medicine that the child was saying, that really sour Robitussin. Right? Nobody wants to take that, but they need to take that, right? So the bitterness of putting oneself in that in a situation to humble themselves before somebody they don't think is worth it, or for them to pray for someone else to get what they really want for themselves, right? But it's the cure. So as they struggle through that and continue to do that, eventually it'll go away. It'll start to fade away. And to such an extent that it may even be replaced by its opposite. So all of these have opposites. And their opposites are the praiseworthy qualities of the hearts that we want to adorn our hearts with. So the opposite of arrogance is humility, right? And humility, the Prophet said, whoever is humble for the sake of Allah, Allah will raise their status. The opposite of hatred is nasiha, that hadith we talked about, sincerely and deeply wanting good for everyone, right? Regardless of who they are, right? And that you could say that that's also the opposite of envy. The opposite of ostentation is sincerity, that regardless of whether anybody knows about it, I'm going to do this for the sake of Allah. And one of the companions said, oh, Prophet, I want to build a mosque. So the Prophet, and he's teaching them this in the moment. It wasn't like sitting down in a class. They're in their streets talking. So he says to the man, the Prophet says to the man, just think about this. You want to build a mosque? Okay. Think about this. If you built the mosque, right, and then all of a sudden everybody mistakenly says so-and-so, some other person built the mosque, and everyone is praising that other person, saying like, oh, he's such a pious person, he's so generous, he built this mosque, and they're ascribing it to the wrong person, right? Would you be bothered? He said, yes. He said, don't build the mosque, right? It's not for Allah, right? And these are the subtleties of the heart, that having somebody guiding one through that, right, is the understanding of what we call the spiritual path, or having a mentor in these regards. And there are people whose hearts are pure, that Allah allows them to be a means of diagnosing their students, telling them, you have this problem, right? Do this, do this, do this to remove it. And they would do with their students, they would go through one sickness to the next sickness. Not everybody has all of them. Some may be more susceptible to arrogance, some may be free of arrogance, and some may be more susceptible to something else. Self-conceit is gratitude. The opposite is gratitude. Gratitude is describing every blessing, the credit of every blessing, 100% of every credit, of 100% of the credit of every blessing to Allah. It's not like, thank you, Allah, 99% and 1%. 1% for me. No, 100% of the credit of every blessing that we have is for Allah. And that's the definition. That's the meaning of Alhamdulillah. The L in Arabic means istighraq. It means entirely. And that's why when you have the translation of Surah Fatiha, is all praise is for Allah. Where's the word all? It's in that L, right? All praise is due to Allah. Not 99.5. 100% of the praise is due. Because, like, say, for instance, coming here today. If Allah didn't want, we wouldn't even have the intention to come here, the desire to come here, right? All of that is from Allah. And we think we're doing it, right? But Allah is just allowing us to go the motions that He is setting forth. And we're just kind of moving along the track. So really, like, just the fact that we are here, right? This situation, the fact that Allah chose each and every individual here to be in a gathering that's beloved to Him, is one of the greatest signs that Allah loves everyone here. Because before we were even created, the divine eternal will already chose that this would happen. All right, and before we were even something to be mentioned, we weren't even born yet, and we were already chosen to be in a place that Allah loves. Now the spoiler of that, right, to taint that would be like, nah, I did it. It was me, right? That's ujub. Right? Gratitude for that is how we avail ourselves of more blessings, an increase in blessings. Love of worldliness is love of the hereafter. That's the opposite of that. The cure of that is remembering death. The cure of loving the world, loving material things, is to remember death. Because a person, they can have all the Ferraris and all the cars and the Bentleys and all these, the G-Wagon, whatever it is. They can have all these things, their yachts and the planes and everything. None of that is going to fit in their grave. Even if they tried to bring it with them, right? And just recently, this poor servant has been put in charge of, partially in charge of taking care of the deceased in our community in Makanji, which includes washing the body, doing the ghusl for the body, shrouding the body, and then burying the body, right? And once you see that, all of these things start to, who cares? Who cares about a car or this or that? When the end is that, right? And preparing for that is worth, right? Is what we're supposed to be doing now. That we are preparing for the moment where our soul is removed from our body, and those last seconds before we die. That if we say, the Prophet said, whoever's last words in this world before they die are La ilaha illallah, immediately they enter paradise. No questions asked, no accounting, no reckoning. But it's not something we can just memorize. Like, okay, I got to say this right before I die. It won't happen unless that's the state of their heart, right? And that's all of this is leading up to that final moment. That if we succeed there, then everything else is absolute bliss. And no matter how good a life we have here, if we fail there, then it wasn't worth it. Tamam. And love of status is similar. Sorry, did I skip any? Ill suspicions. That's a good question, actually. They mentioned about ill suspicions to have a kind of a process that we go through, because it's natural. We're not accountable for our thoughts. That's the first thing. Thoughts are seen as like an involuntary guest. You can't stop somebody from knocking on your door, right? Someone just shows up in your house and knocks on your door. You can't stop that. So the same thing with a thought, right? Bad thoughts come to the mind. We're not accountable until we start entertaining those thoughts and we start making them our own thoughts, right? We open the door for that person. Now we're accountable. So if it's just the passing thoughts, then we just say astaghfirullah and keep going. We don't even pay it as much mind as we normally would. But if it's something that we really are thinking, like, nah, this guy is, right? This guy is this way or this guy, and it's baseless suspicions. Like if someone is literally like walking in with a knife, like, and your suspicion was he's going to hurt somebody, that's probably true, right? Why is my man walking in with a butcher knife, right? Right. So that's not what's meant here. Right? These are baseless suspicions, right? Things that are not based on any reality or evidence or proof or outward sign. It's just like, nah, I think he's insincere. Right. The way to around that is kind of to just reframe the issue. Say, how do I know? Maybe his state with Allah is much better than mine. Right? Maybe outwardly they're doing something sin, but maybe in private at night they're crying to Allah and their state is much better than mine. Maybe they have humility. Maybe my looking at them is a sign that I have worse things to deal with than they. So there's just some things. And there's quite a few books out there that talk about these, but they're a science in themselves. And alhamdulillah, we have so many books. I would recommend, just as a final recommendation, the Book of Assistance. It's called the Book of Assistance by Imam Abdullah bin Ali bin Haddad, that Imam Haddad. And his last name is Al-Haddad. Al-Haddad is actually an ironsmith, right? So it's a nickname that he acquired because they call him Haddadul Qulub. He's the blacksmith of the hearts. So the blacksmith, what did they do? They heat up metals and they chip away the rust, right? And this is what essentially his books we're meant to do for our hearts, right? The rust that we have on our hearts. And his books, mashallah, they're very accessible. They're easy to read. And he focuses more on the practical than the theory. It's like, okay, do this, right? And in Yemen, what they would do, they would study the book, but they would read first chapter, and they would not move to the second chapter until they implemented the first, right? That's how they would read books there, right? Yeah, I mean, you could read the book in one day. It's not that long. But to do it that way, it takes a lot of time. The Book of Assistance. Yeah, inshallah. Inshallah. I believe it's still in print. Any book by Imam Haddad is good. If anyone wants to learn about like death and what happens after death, he has another book called Lives of Man. Like the different stages of life from when we were created. Yeah, from Yemen, yeah. The Lives of Man. His house in Yemen is still preserved. It's literally like, maybe like, this room's too big to even use as an example. It's like this entryway, about that size, this little entryway corner. And he would have, at all times, he would always have an orphan. Anytime the orphan would grow up and old enough to get married, he would get another orphan to take care of him. And he would grow up. And he was blind, in fact, but him and his wife would feed over 300 families every day, right? And when he was a child, even prior to puberty, he would have a lesson after Fajr in the local masjid, and then he would pray 200 voluntary rakats, 200 units of prayer every day. And that was at like 12, 13 years old. Right? So imagine how he was when he was 30. Imagine how he was when he was 50. And he passed away in his 80s. Right? He passed away 3 years before the Taj Mahal was built. Right? Just to give some contextual reference. MashaAllah. May Allah bless you all. MashaAllah, I know it's late. MashaAllah, there's only so much coffee you can drink. You start getting the jitters.